I'll stay down below.
Okay. Well, all right, everybody. Good morning. I see Chancellor Rogers is on. All right. Yes. Good morning, everybody. It is 8:03 in the AM, Tuesday, August 22nd, and we are back for our latest installment of the Energy for All Alaska Task Force. We had such a lively discussion last week that we actually invited back the speaker to conclude the presentation because we only got about halfway through, right when we were getting to what she hoped would be the focus of the presentation. We were done. We were out of time. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Miss Gwen Holdmann, Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at UAF, to continue our discussion of lessons we might learn from the Iceland and its electrical grid, its evolution. So without further ado, Miss, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation.
We still get to interrupt her all we want, though. Right?
All you like, sir.
Oh,
we should have no problem with time.
You're muted.
Oh, you're muted, Gwen. See.
Okay, sorry about that. Don't.
Good.
Nope. Presentation. Oh, you keep muting, Gwen.
Oh, that's so strange.
There you go.
Oh, that's not good. I'm having a hard time seeing the video and staying off mute. Let me, okay. I got to see my presentation. Hang on one second here.
Okay. Can everyone else see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Again, we've lost use of our second monitor, which is the one I used to use to monitor the participants, look for raised hands, watch the chat. And I really can't do that because the second monitor has gone out. So I would just request that as we move through the presentation, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, you feel free to just go ahead and bring yourself off mute and fire away. All right, carry on.
Perfect. Okay, so I did make some changes. There were some requests about taking a closer look at renewables and particularly the geothermal industry. So if you want to just go to the next slide, I'll just show what I did. Iceland, this is the presentation for this week. So I've kind of scrubbed the stuff that we did before, some of those comparisons, things like that. I'll talk a little bit about Iceland geothermal development. That's something that I'm pretty familiar with. I've done a lot of work on that, but I didn't really touch that much on it last time. So I'll just go through that quickly. And then what I really wanted to go to was their electricity market. And so we started to touch on aspects of that last time. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth and then talk about some of the policies that Iceland's had over time that have been really relevant to developing the market that they have today. And then if we have time left, so this is like the bonus round, if there's time left, we can talk a little bit about some of the things they're doing in terms of innovation, small business development, and this geothermal training program that they have. So a lot of that's really about value-added process and building out a knowledge economy, which I also think is super interesting and presents opportunities for lessons learned for Alaska, but we'll only go there if we have time. Otherwise, we'll have to do a round 3 or something like that, Jomo. So, all right. So go ahead, next slide. So for those of you that weren't here last time, I showed this slide, which is just a super quick comparison. If you haven't been to Iceland, I highly recommend it. It's, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And that's being said from someone who's lived in Alaska for 30 years. There's about half the number of residents in Iceland as there is in Alaska. Alaska is much bigger. And so I just want to make this point, though, which is that when you're looking at the rail belt grid, from a geographic standpoint, they're actually pretty similar in size. So that's like kind of the focus of this presentation is really similarities between the Iceland energy market and the rail belt grid. And so I do really want to make that point. And I put the little map in the bottom that basically Akureyri is sort of like the Fairbanks of Iceland. Reykjavik is like the Anchorage of Iceland, and it takes about 6 hours to drive between those two. And they have some of probably more extreme weather conditions than we do for good chunks of the year as well. They're not quite as cold, but they have pretty incredible wind, rain, sleet, all of the above kind of conditions. And then just a few other things, Iceland ranks really high on the Human Development Index. I actually forgot to look up where the US is, but I'm quite certain it's lower. They grow more than 50% of their food domestically. I'll touch on that super briefly in the presentation. And their electricity and heating are almost 100% renewables. So if we just kind of jump on, I'll talk a little bit more about some of those grid metrics later. So I'm not going to hit on those. Go ahead to the next slide, Jomo.
Actually, what I would note is that
yeah,
well, it looks like they've got about a third more installed capacity than we do. Where's that be? Almost 50%. Their sales are through the roof. It's like 3 times their electric sales.
It's more than 3 times on a per capita basis. It's about 5.5 times the sales of Alaska. And so this is something, I think a lot of you over the years have probably heard me talk about Iceland before. But this is sort of a piece of the narrative that I don't think is that well understood. People think of Iceland as being this place where they've achieved this, close to 100%, at least for the electric power market, renewable penetration. But people don't also realize that they have this like very high energy intensity, one of the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world on a per capita basis. And that actually also winds up all of these factors, including this restructuring of their electric power market, have sort of converged to mean that Iceland has incredibly low cost of power as well. And so, it's a small place. A lot of people say, we can't do things in Alaska because we're so small. We don't have economies of scale. But Iceland's actually been able to achieve a lot of the things that I think Alaska would like to get to. And so, for me, it's actually a really important and kind of illustrative case in terms of very affordable power, high quality of living, and a very beautiful place that focuses a lot on the natural beauty of the environment and things like that. So, all right, whoops, maybe I will. All right. Are you guys, you don't see me on the screen, do you, Jomo? Can I turn off my video?
You can turn off your video. It'll help you with the bandwidth.
Yeah,
for sure.
I'm gonna turn. Yeah. Am I having bandwidth issues? You guys hear me okay?
You had just glitched a little bit right at the very end, but now you're doing good.
Okay, I'll go outside again. Okay, so I glossed over this slide pretty quickly in the last presentation. This shows Iceland's primary energy consumption. So this is across all sectors. This doesn't just include electric power. And so this includes heating and transportation as well. And one thing, that I really like about Iceland is that they do really focus on energy and reducing carbon footprint across all sectors, not just electric power. We tend to focus a lot on electric power and not as much on like heating and transportation quite as much in Alaska for the most part. But you can see this basically presents the same exact information in 2 ways. The one question that I'm going to ask Ellie, not now, but Ellie, at some point, I need you to tell me, what is coal still being used for? And I suspect that might actually be peat, is my guess, because Iceland did use local peat along with imported coal, back at the 100 years ago or so. But I'd be really surprised if they're importing any coal nowadays. I'm wondering if that's like local peat that's still being used in some of the farms or something like that. But the oil sector there is mostly for transportation. The fishing industry is a pretty big and important part of Iceland's economy, and that's a difficult nut for them to crack when it comes to decarbonizing their energy streams. Now, their power is generated about 80% from hydroelectric, but you see that's a smaller slice of the pie here at the bottom. And the reason for that is because almost all of the heating in Iceland is done with geothermal. And so even though geothermal only generates 20% or so of electric power, it's virtually all of the heating in Iceland. So if you want to switch to the next slide. I want to hit on a couple of these geothermal things. So I just included a few pictures here. And so this is kind of what we often think of, or at least I do anyway, when we think of geothermal in Alaska, a big modern conventional geothermal power plant. We've got pipes running all over the place from wells to the powerhouse, and then also, into communities for meeting the district heating needs. But go ahead and switch to the next slide. This is from downtown Reykjavik. This is one of their pumping stations for feeding into the district heating system in Reykjavik. The water actually comes from about, I don't know, I think 70 kilometers away or so, and is it comes from different places, but a good chunk of it comes from some distance away, and then it's distributed across the city in these like fairly nondescript pump houses. This is an example, and then that little insert picture there is I think that's part of the district heating system as well. I think it may be an injection or a production well that's there in the community itself. In a minute here, I'm gonna stop and let Ellie talk, but I'm gonna blast through 2 more slides, and then I'm gonna see if he has anything to add to that. Next slide.
I'll simply note that 70 kilometers is quite a distance
To pump water.
and to have it still be at a usable temperature for district heating.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly high flow rate. It's an insulated pipe. It's above ground. And so, yeah, they don't see a very big temperature decrease from where the water starts to when it gets to Reykjavik. I think it's only like a half a degree or so. So
Would you say the temperatures in Iceland are more comparable to, say, Anchorage or Fairbanks?
from a climate standpoint,
Yes.
definitely more like Anchorage, approaching like Southeast Alaska more. So geographically, they're fairly close to us actually, but they benefit from that North Atlantic current. So overall, from a temperature standpoint, the climate is quite a lot warmer. However, I mean, in the north, it's cooler. It's like, again, there's a lot of analogies with Fairbanks and Akureyri, but the big difference for me compared to like Fairbanks or even Anchorage is that they get really crazy like wind storms and snowstorms, and it's just a very dynamic climate, and it can be pretty nasty, especially like traveling between some of the capital city and some of these outlying areas. They experience a lot of like power outages, sometimes with power lines going down, avalanches. It's a really challenging environment for all kinds of reasons. And again, that's a comparison to Alaska. So
Thank you.
this is my daughter. So Ellie didn't see these slides, so this will be kind of fun. But she's sitting on top of a brand new baby volcano that formed behind this town, and this is in the Westman Islands, in kind of off the southern coast of Iceland. It's a remote community, and one day they woke up and there was a little baby volcano that was erupting behind their town. And so, at first it was a pretty big emergency. They, spent time trying to protect their harbor. They had a really nice natural harbor, and there was, concern that the lava flow would kind of close off that harbor. They actually used like ships, like firefighting ships, and like tried to stop the lava flow or redirect it using water. But in the end, they were pretty successful. Some of the town was buried in lava, but this isn't the kind of like kind of aggressive like eruptions that you might see in Alaska. These are really for the most part, pretty well behaved volcanoes, because it's basaltic rock. They're sitting on this spreading zone. It's really liquidy lava, so it just kind of like flows out over the ground. They don't really have these explosive volcanic eruptions as much as we might think of like in Alaska, where half a mountain can get blown off fairly regularly if we have an eruption in the Aleutians or something. So anyway, after the point of this picture is though that Icelanders are super innovative, and after the immediate emergency was over, they went about tapping into this new source of heat and developed a small district heating system in the community. They didn't have any form of geothermal before this. This was kind of a big surprise. And so they initially built out this district heating system from the cooling magma. Eventually it cooled more than that system that then was feasible to continue to heat the town from the magma supply. But I believe that they're actually using electric power for the most part now to heat the district heating system in this community. And so Ellie, I'm actually going to pass it off to you and see if you have any comments on any of those things I just said.
Yeah, you were correct about the eruption investment islands. Thank you. The eruption investment islands was in 1974, and they evacuated the whole island just over 2 days or something like that, using more or less fishing boats and all available ships in the area. They managed to save all the people. There were, I think, 5,500 people that were living there. Or if it took a week or so, I don't really remember. But there was only one casualty during that time, and that was the local drinker. He was sleeping in the basement of some house, and unfortunately he died. So you were correct with the, they used fire hoses, fire pumps, and pumped seawater and trying to protect the entrance of the harbor. And there are probably 20 years since they couldn't cope any longer with the waste heat of the leftovers of the heat energy in the lava for district heating. So they are solely using the majority of the energy for district heat investment islands is electricity, but they also have two large fish meal factories, and they built two tube and shell heat exchangers to try to reuse waste heat from the fish meal factories and for heating up the water for the apartments. But I think that today the fish meal factories are getting so practical towards energy that they use most of their own energy just within the process. So
where does the electricity come from?
It's a sea cable from land.
Ah, okay.
And but there are issues there. There were some incidents. I think there were one or two. There were one cable, and that was more or less just getting worn or used out. It needed to have more capacity. Then they had another cable, and I think the distance is maybe 20 kilometers or 20 kilometers or so over there. I can look it up. It's not really far, but they had damage on the cable 2 years ago, I think, and no one did know what happened with the cable. But then they had to use just diesel engines to provide energy for the islands. But the Icelandic TSO Landsnet has now renewed that cable, and that was a quite famous project how they did that, and they needed to have repair the cable. They needed to have quick decisions. Of course, you need to be able to repair such cable. You need to have ship probably from Norway or somewhere in most likely from Norway sailing over to Iceland, because we have no infrastructure or stationary equipment here, ship or so, to deal with sea cables.
Yeah, one of the things that really surprised me when I was over living kind of in Iceland for a while is how many diesel generators there actually are in Iceland. There's a fair number, and a big use of those is backup power for some of these outlying communities. This is just one example, but when there can be power interruptions, and so they really have some challenges with resiliency on their grid as a whole, and that's something that this organization, is transmission system operator Landsnet, is charged with dealing with. So, but I'll go to the next slide. A couple more pictures here. This is changing course a little bit, but staying with the heating theme. This is a really small, tiny district heating system. It's called Bergstadir, and this is the owner of this particular small district heating system. He's just a local entrepreneur. This is entirely privately owned. He drilled a small geothermal well on his property. Access temperatures right around 100 Celsius, so right around the boiling point of water. And then he distributes hot water to about 40 local, farms and neighbors that are on average about a half a kilometer apart, so some distance. And so this is just one example of this small district heating system. Now, in Iceland, the challenge with these heating systems is people don't have backup heat. So power is one thing if you lose power, but you can't lose heat. And so because the heating system is based around these district heating systems, there needs to be backup generation in case the grid goes down for these backup for these small geothermal systems. So he's got a backup diesel generator. The reason I was working with him is the question was, could you actually he needed to cool his geothermal water. It's too hot to run into the district heating system. So he was tempering it and cooling it by mixing it with cold water. And so the question is, could you first generate power, feed that onto the grid, and then feed that into your district heat system? So the grid actually becomes your backup source of power. So that was what we were exploring there. As an example, the pipes that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, those are actually manufactured in Iceland. I've gone to this pipe factory several times myself, and actually over more than a decade, and they're continuing to evolve and innovate in terms of like the kinds and designs of these pipes they have. Now, they obviously import the raw materials, but they fabricate those there in Iceland and then use them pretty broadly. And then you can see they just lay them in a trench that's dug up on the top, and it's like pretty simple. This is a simple system. Again, I'm not suggesting that all of these are totally analogous to what we could do in Alaska, but Icelanders are doing a lot of pretty practical things in innovative ways, and I think that's pretty cool.
That companies manufactures those pipes. They are in collaboration with Rehau in Germany, I know, and I have been picking up some of their markets and standards and so on. They have been involved with project in Greenland, for example, where, you know, Greenland is more or less just a rock, or so they are partly, I think, laid down overground and buried over. So, you know, I'm not 100% familiar with the ground in Alaska, but as I said, they have been involved with some district heating investment projects in Greenland. Well,
yeah. So Iceland doesn't have permafrost, and looking at this, you would think, oh, it's just this beautiful soil, which is really not the case. It's a pretty rocky place, but yeah, they don't have permafrost, so that's not an issue that they deal with. Next.
I look forward to your presentation to the legislature regarding the comparison of Icelandic and American regulatory regimes.
Well, actually, that is the nice thing about having Ellie over in Iceland and really digging into some of these things. I have lots of questions on that, because one thing I can say about Iceland is that in my just kind of non-educated, just from an observational standpoint, they get away with a lot of things that would never fly in the US or Alaska, like that they just get away with, and they just do. That's pretty incredible. So I'll just leave it at that for now. But I'm always curious, like how those sorts of things work over there, what regulation, what the structure looks like.
Yeah,
next.
They've managed to hold the clock at the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, I can't say that for sure, but that is certainly not the case when it comes to their energy market, which is really, hopefully we'll get there. Hopefully we'll actually get there today. Okay. So I did show this slide last time, but I just want to refresh our memory of this. So electricity production by source in Iceland tracked really closely to Alaska. So this isn't the rail belt. This is all of Alaska. From the 70s until like the mid 90s, you know, you can kind of see there's a very similar trajectory, and then it goes in a completely different direction. And it actually, if you switch to the next slide, I created a new chart that shows this a little bit more clearly. So I actually overlaid the two exactly. And you can really see this here, you know, where they track almost exactly right up until about 1997. And then there's this like very clear divergence. And so for me, this begs the question, probably does for most people, this isn't something that's part of the normal narrative maybe, but I'm like, hey, what happened? Why did these diverge so dramatically? And so last time we kind of talked about this, next slide, briefly, that this is largely largely due to their energy intensive industries and sort of a national strategy around inviting in particular, aluminum smelters and building out generation to meet the needs of those sort of place-based industries. Aluminum smelting in particular is really energy intensive. That's why there's a lot of value placed on recycling aluminum cans. And so aluminum companies that are producing aluminum are looking for places that have really low cost, long-term power contracts that they can enter into. That's why, for example, the Pacific Northwest often had a lot of aluminum smelting there, and Iceland is a really good market for that. So we talked a little bit last time, Ellie did, about some of the history and legacy, their need to have, foreign currency, build up an economy, because they were one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in Europe a couple of generations ago. And so looking for an industrial base beyond just fishing and farming was important to them. And this is sort of where they converge to. Next slide.
Speaking of the refining industry, I thought you said last time that, again, the value of having reliable, inexpensive power is so valuable that they're shipping in dirt from Australia.
Yeah, I mean, bauxite.
That's literally the other side of the planet.
Yeah, it's Iceland. The ore is not being mined in Iceland or really anywhere close to Iceland. Bauxite ore is actually found mostly in more equatorial regions. I'm actually not sure why that is, but it seems to be the case. And so it's being shipped from really long ways away. I mean, not just Australia, but that would be one example where there's a lot of bauxite mining going on, and they ship it all the way to Iceland just because of these low power costs. So it just shows how being remote isn't necessarily a disadvantage if you have, have a reliable and affordable source of energy. Now, I do want to, be careful here to state that and Ellie could obviously add on to this quite extensively, but, there is some controversy around the smelting industry in Iceland. And so, I am not, I'm not suggesting that we want to invite aluminum smelters into Alaska to grow our load. That's not really the takeaway here. But the point is that they did see this substantive load growth, and the side benefit to that was a really low cost of power for the local population in Iceland. One of the things I'm hoping Ellie can do is dig a little bit more into historical price structures in Iceland to see if we can actually demonstrate that there was a decrease in price. I'm almost sure there has to have been, but I don't know that. I don't have the data on that right now. Ellie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you're right. There was a decrease in, and compared to consumer price index and such things, electrical price have not been, holding up against such things. So, relatively price of electricity is getting cheaper.
Yeah, so Jomo mentioned this previously. So this is kind of similar data, but this is for 1 year snapshot for 2021, I think. And this just shows you the net annual generation, the difference between the two. Iceland is producing 4 times more power than the rail belt grid is. But you got to remember, the rail belt grid has quite a bit more people that it serves, over 500,000 compared to about 300 and some thousand for Iceland. So next slide. So when you look at it on a per capita basis, it's more like 5.5 times more power generated. And this is what the delivered cost of power is in, I could have maybe done a nicer job presenting this, but I think you get the point. So the average delivered cost of power for Iceland and a rail belt for both kind of don't take this too precisely. This is kind of an average rolled together with some different data, but we'll actually show some of the bills from specific Icelandic commercial. This is large commercial in Iceland, but not aluminum smelters. So this is large kind of domestic commercial businesses, and we'll show a little bit more on that in a minute. And then that 11 cents for Iceland for residential consumers, that would be in the capital city. Okay, next slide. So a really big piece, kind of a really important initial step, or a step that went hand in hand with really building out the energy sector was the formation or development of this ring grid in Iceland. I mentioned this last time. So this looks very, very similar narrative to Alaska, which is part of why I'm really interested in it, and that they had like 4 independent kind of load serving areas that were that kind of grew up in conjunction with different populations in Iceland. And there was a decision made by the government to interconnect those. So the actual interconnections were built and owned by the national power company. So essentially like our Alaska Energy Authority owns like the Alaska Intertie and some other pieces of transmission in Bradley Lake. In their case, the national power company is called Landsverken, and they owned these transmission interties that were built by the state and some of the really large hydroelectric projects that were developed largely to support heavy industry. Do you have anything to add to that, Ellie?
No, nothing else than your investment in electrical infrastructure. If you talk about generation, have been holding hands to hands with foreign investment in the heavy industry. That's pretty clear.
Yeah. Next.
Is the middle of Iceland not really developed or populated?
Good question. Ellie.
No one lives there. Those are the highlands, maybe above 400 to 1,000 meters above sea level, and you have some cabins there, and this is mainly untouched area, and probably the biggest. And as it is untouched area, such areas are getting higher in value, for the humankind as we are living. Then there are really strong concerns about building transmission assets or more hydros in that area. That is the major conflict here.
Thank you, Ellie.
Yeah, so Iceland is not part of the European Union. And actually, Ellie, I might just have you go ahead and explain the relationship between Iceland and the European Union, because it's pretty important to the rest of this narrative.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, it's good that you stated that Iceland is not part of the European Union, but we have access to the European internal market, and we got that with this agreement. I think it was in 1990 or something like that, along with the other countries that you see on the slide. And we got full access to the European market in exchange for adopting European legislation, by and large. We have some amendments or some deviations from a lot of articles, especially towards energy and farming. But despite of, if you rule that out, we just have to pick up the rest of European legislation. And that goes as well for Norway, Liechtenstein, but Switzerland has a little bit different approach to that. That is probably the biggest reason why Iceland there are 2 big reasons, I think, that Iceland is not part of the European Union, is that because of our fisheries, we are really afraid of foreign or reluctant to allow. There are specific laws stated around that about foreign investment in the fisheries, and we are also really protective towards our farming. So the reason for or the consequences of that, we were part of this EFTA alliance, that's a parallel alliance with the parallel legal alliance with the European Union, is that we needed to unbundle our energy market and separate. There was a mandate or directive from the European Union that it was put in act to begin with, I think in 1990, 1995, something. To that, the meaning of that act was to fully separate generation and electrical generation and transmission, with the goal of freeing up old monopolies and create with the goal of creating an active commercial market for those, if you say, commodities or necessities.
Yeah, and this is where the story between Iceland and Alaska really diverge, because both of them are these islanded grids. And in the case of Alaska and the rail belt grid in particular, like we've escaped most or the majority of like sort of the deregulation restructuring that's happened in the lower 48 grid, because a lot of the FERC regulations, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulations, don't apply to Alaska because we don't have interstate commerce. We're not interconnected with the North American electric grid system. And so we have not been compelled to do a lot of the restructuring that's happened in most electricity markets, kind of in the developed world, at least in Europe and in North America. And so that's just a factor. And this is kind of where things diverge. Like, I don't think Iceland was super excited about unbundling these GNT assets. That wasn't something they were like, yes, we can't wait to do this. They were basically compelled to do it. I think, though, that Ellie, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that most folks in Iceland would actually say that even though this was painful and at the time they were kicking and screaming a little bit, it was overall considered to be a really good transition that's actually helped sort of clarify and basically create a lot of transparency in the market. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I would say that, there is fair acceptance for this procedure that, started 20 years ago or something like that, or even more. The main concerns, this unbundling process from the European Union has been, taken in steps. There are so-called packages of legislative directed from the European Union, and most of Iceland's concerns, they go along with what I mentioned before regarding the fisheries. Iceland is afraid of that. Some people in Europe will have management or have some authority over Icelandic energy, and those concerns, have been the main concerns. But as Gwen stated before, I have never, all the people that I've been talking about within this industry for the last 6 months, no one is raising any issues that this was unsuccessful. I would say this was quite successful.
Dr.
Okay.
Davies, I see you.
So I have a
Yes.
question for Gwen. So Gwen, why would that not be a good thing for Alaska?
I'm not suggesting it's not. I think that is actually probably the main takeaway. And Ellie and I have been working on a paper. I actually think that there's a lot of reasons why Alaska could or should, or it would make sense for us to sort of follow a similar trajectory in terms of deregulating or, kind of disaggregating our energy market. And so what I've been trying to focus on right now a little bit is what these lessons learned from Iceland look like. And then eventually, I'm actually headed to Valdez on my sailboat because I'm going to the Alaska Power Association meeting. The goal would be is like, how could some of these be applied to the Alaska market? This presentation is one that I've actually been giving, or I developed, and Ellie and I have built this paper largely around being directed at the utility industry and at the legislature and task force, governor's task force. So this is actually the first time we've really presented it to a totally different audience. So yeah, I think that I think that this would be a good direction that we should think about going, John. So next slide. That's the point of this presentation. Next slide. So I was kind of thinking, not everybody here is an expert in the energy industry. I like to put things pretty clearly for myself. So I threw this slide in last night. If like a Tom DeLong is on here, there may be ways to restate this. But basically, the reason why the utility industry was restructured or deregulated, or what that means, is because, historically, the utility industry as a whole, including the grid system, has operated as a regulated monopoly. And the reason is because it's where kind of these sort of more free market things fail, because basically the cost of infrastructure is really, really high. So, you can't really make investments in infrastructure without knowing that you're going to be able to recoup those costs over some period of time. And so these natural monopolies around the utility industry, grew up historically in the US and in Europe. Over time now, with innovation and changing technology, there's been this opportunity for more and more diversity and more players to enter into the power generation side of things and production and sales. But it still makes sense to kind of manage the transmission system as like sort of that regulated monopoly. And so, in order to sort of restructure the power sector, what is effectively done, like the big thing with like tons of little details, but the big thing is to separate the transmission system away from what has historically been sort of this private asset. So a bunch of different utilities owning, or entities, it doesn't have to be a utility necessarily, owning stretches of transmission, kind of like what we have in a rail belt right now, right? So if you want to wheel power from like Fire Island up to Fairbanks, you have to go through Chugach's territory and MEA's territory that each own stretches of the transmission line. And then you have the Alaska Intertie that's owned by the Alaska Energy Authority. And then you have Golden Valley's transmission network. So you're going through these like different kinds of privately owned, by that entity, stretches of transmission, paying tariffs, and you get these pancaking rates, and it becomes very difficult to move power from one area to another. And so this idea of kind of opening up the transmission system as sort of like an interstate highway. You don't want to have it's such expensive infrastructure. You don't want to have a bunch of competing different transmission lines. Like that's not feasible, right? So you want to open that up like the highway that everybody can use. The rules are clear. Everyone plays by the same rules and everyone has access to that highway, that electrical highway. And then on the other side, on electricity production and sales, you can have like real diversity in that market. And so that can follow a lot more by, through like kind of general sort of, free market principles, as long as you have like sort of standardization and transparency and everyone kind of has equitable access to that market. And so that's like Gwen's words for like the big picture of why we want to restructure and deregulate, and why there's been pressure to do so, and why it probably does make sense for us to do so in Alaska as well, because of this issue around right now the rail belt being a bunch of different individual chunks of transmission that are essentially private, treated like a private good by the different utilities and by the entities that operate it. And so if we can make it more of a public highway, it's one way that kind of frees up some of the congestion and would allow us to do more interesting things, including building out and modernizing it with all of the federal funding resources that are available right now. So I feel like this is an important kind of step for Alaska to take, and the time is now, because of the opportunity for major like generational investments in our transmission infrastructure as part of like a broader federal strategy.
I have a question on that, if I could.
Yeah.
Gwen, you'll recall 9-10 years ago, we had I had several roundtable discussions with the utilities on this very topic, introducing them to American Transmission Company out of Wisconsin, proposing the same thing and you have really stated the case succinctly and excellently. It would lower our costs if we did have a public highway, as it were, for our electricity. Can you describe, it may be a little bit off of the topic, but because you are talking to the legislature, can you describe what has happened in these past 10 years? That relationship was going to be adopted, and then several complications came in. Chugach swallowed up Anchorage municipal power, whatever it's called. Can you describe some of what has happened in the last 10 years that has stopped this process from occurring earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to a couple things there. So American Transmission, AMC, was a for-profit entity. Okay, so there's one piece here that I actually haven't included in this presentation, but is in the paper, because Ellie and I have been spending quite a bit of time trying to understand this. Just because you have this open highway, this transmission system operator is kind of like the general way that we call this. They can be a for-profit entity. They can be a nonprofit entity. They can be privately owned and managed. They can be publicly or state owned and managed. There's a lot of different flavors of what this can look like. And there's a lot of different examples of different models and different companies. This is quite important for us to have a clear understanding of. A place like Iceland, and I'm stepping out a little bit, and Ellie, I'm actually gonna say this the way that I've heard this said by like Halla Gund and others, you know, in Iceland, because I do want to get this narrative straight. You know, in many places, the way this worked, and we'll kind of go into this, is that it's even municipally owned for either like regional distribution systems or for the transmission system operator. A lot of the municipal utilities own shares in the organization that's this transmission system operator. And it can be still run as like a for-profit kind of thing where the municipalities are actually relying on revenue coming from that transmission system, that entity, that company that they own shares in for part of their budget. And this can create challenges. And I know there's some challenges in Norway related to this. I think it's more at the regional level, not necessarily at the national level. But what Iceland has sort of chosen to do over time is really make sure that this is truly a public good, and so that it is owned by the state. They don't feel, what I have heard Icelanders in these positions of influence, specifically with their regulatory commission, their version of that tell me, is that Iceland can't afford to have like another for-profit entity that's like basically sucking up some sort of profit. Like, we need to ensure that there's the lowest cost for the highest value to the consumers in Iceland. And because we're a small market, there's just not economies of scale to have another for-profit transmission system operator in that loop. We need that to be a truly kind of nonprofit, state-owned entity. And so they've actually migrated more to that direction, including like very recent legislation that has mandated that the state should own all of the transmission assets, and that local utilities cannot have part ownership. Local municipalities, which, you know, are associated with the utility industry, cannot have part ownership. And that's really that true separation between generators and the transmission system. They really want clear separation there, so that generators are not, you know, mucking around with, or the local utilities are not unduly influencing the politics or decision making in that transmission system operator. So they've really moved in this direction in Iceland. That is not true for every country in Europe. In fact, some of them have almost moved away from that toward a more for-profit entity, which would be sort of like the AMC version, which would come in and build the transmission, but then they're expecting a rate of return on their investment, right? So that's kind of where we're at. That's the inflection point in Alaska. And I also think that that's where things got fairly, you know, kind of wrapped up in trying to figure out what the best choice was. And then sometimes when you're trying to figure out what the best direction is, you just get sort of in this quagmire. And we've tried to take small steps, like with this Railbelt Reliability Council and things like that in Alaska. But that's where we're at right now. So that was a very long answer. I'm sorry for that.
It's good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Next slide. Holy cow. Okay. I should have switched this one a long time ago. So Landsnet was basically, so there was this, you know, originally Landsverken, which was their national power company. In some ways, if you want to kind of look at analogous Alaska organizations, the Alaska Energy Authority plays a similar role to like what Landsverken did. They also place AEA is sort of like a conglomeration between their National Energy Authority and some of these other things. So we don't have like perfect overlays of these different entities, but they had this national power company. It was divided in two. So the generation and transmission assets were split apart, and this organization called Landsnet was formed. And that was a direct result of this unbundling of the power sector, of the power industry. And so let's just go to the next slide and see. I think there's this is what it looks like today. Like Ellie said, most Icelanders live, relatively close to the coast. There are some of these geothermal resources and hydroelectric resources that are up in the highlands and things like that. But for the most part, it follows what they call the ring road, which is why Ellie and I are calling this the ring grid, as kind of a corollary to the rail belt grid. But you can see they have a large number of generation stations. It's really similar to Alaska. If anything, they have far more. There's dozens of independent power producers that produce about 5% of Iceland's power and feed into this grid, from small farmers to larger entities. There's still a lot of municipal utilities that are quite active in own generation. So it's a really diverse market. I'm trying to get like a little bit of a better grip on exactly what it looks like. But Ellie, you kind of looked at some numbers in terms of the proportion that's like publicly owned, state owned versus like municipally and independent power producer owned. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, there are some micro hydros here. They count, I think, for maybe less than 5% of the total generation market here. There is, if you can say that the municipalities and the state can be defined as, can be defined as, state or governance or something like that. That there is only one generating company in Iceland that is not fully, if we set aside the micro hydros, there is only one generating company that's not fully owned by either the state or the municipalities. And it was for Iceland, there's a really heartbroken story. They lost the ownership of that one during the financial crisis. They had built this quite large geothermal power plant in the Reykjanes Peninsula near the airport, and they were in serious debt, and they sold it to some investment fund. I think the investment fund has 50% or 49 point something stakeholder in that company, and Icelanders grieve that quite much. But the rest of it is either owned by the state or the munis.
Thanks. I realize we got to do a little bit of a time check. Let's go to the next slide. So I think we kind of covered this asset ownership for generation. Let's go on, because I want to get to some of these bills, because these are more interesting. I think this is what people want to see. Okay, consumer energy price structure. Ellie, I'm just going to zip through this really quickly. Basically when Ellie decides where he wants to buy his power from. And again, I just want to state, not all of these things are a perfect example of like cut and paste to Alaska. I do think that there are some differences here that we would probably do some things a little different. But they are a pretty illustrative example. He gets to pick where he's going to buy power from. So these are all either companies that actually generate power, so like kind of what our version of a co-op would be, or it could also be kind of an aggregator that's sort of like selling and buying power, more cheaply, or doing, kind of in the market. And so he can pick who he's going to buy power from. It's very clear who that is. He can switch when he wants to. Most Icelanders, the cost of power is so cheap that they don't spend a lot of time agonizing over this. So it's about 5 cents per kilowatt hour, as you can kind of see there. And so then if you want to switch to the next slide. So here's kind of a consumer pricing example. So Ellie, I'm just going to say this, just go through here real quick. We have 2 examples. Ellie put all of this together. One is for somebody living in a more remote area that's further from the main generation stations in the West Fjords, in that kind of red area there. And the other lives in the capital city in Reykjavik. And so the first example is from that more remote area. The second example is from the capital city. And so you see that energy unit price, which is 4 cents a kilowatt hour. They have a tax applied to that, which is just under 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So they're paying like a total of 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Then they have a wheeling cost. And this is, again, where I think that there would be a different way to do this in Alaska. We might want to look at other models like the Texas ERCOT model that doesn't do it quite this way. But in the case of Iceland, they basically pay a wheeling cost. And that's basically a per mile basis. And so the person living in the more remote area has a higher cost for wheeling. But then what they do next is that they have this equalizing fee. And so everyone pays the same equalizing fee, but then the person that does live in a higher cost area gets a subsidy. So their cost of power is reduced based on like all payers kind of buying into the system and then subsidizing folks that are in the more outlying areas. One thing for Iceland is they really want to try to keep population in some of these more outlying areas. The West Fjords, for example, is a place where there's been population decline, one of the few areas in Iceland. And so, you know, making sure that the cost of energy is not a prohibiting factor to live there or have businesses there is important. So anyways, then you get to this 8 cents or 6 cents for the cost for power. And then you can see like that's for the wheeling cost. And then you've got the total there at, you know, somewhere between 14 and 11 cents or something like that. So that's for consumer pricing. We've got a couple other examples here. Should I just bang through them real quick and then we can ask questions?
Sure.
So here's a small commercial example of that Ellie had a connection with. So again, these are like real bills that we have from real companies. So this is a construction company. It's a smaller company that's up in, you know, kind of a fairly remote area of northern Iceland. And so you can kind of see same kind of bill structure, but their average price is about 12.7 cents. So it's really not that different from the residential consumer. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so this is just an example, and I didn't actually check this with Ellie, but you know, they do a lot of local production of food there. I know when I've spoken to the folks at some of these farms, they complain about the high cost of energy for heat and power, which I guess no matter what you pay, everyone's always going to complain about these things. So next slide, again, like Iceland does grow about 50% or more. This is one of the things Ellie's kind of going to help untangle for us of the food in Iceland. So you can see here, like, for example, the vast majority of cucumbers and about, I don't know, 75% of tomatoes are grown domestically, which is super cool. Again, they don't have a climate that different from Alaska. So this is almost all greenhouse stuff, right? Okay, next slide. And then they have, you know, their Icelanders are always also remarkable at this is my kids again with bananas. They're very good at marketing. They are really, really good at telling good stories. So they have the furthest north banana plantation. It's very, very tiny, but they get to claim that. And you know, even things like the Blue Lagoon, you know, it's really just effluent from a power plant, and it's become one of the best, you know, best tourist attractions in the world. Basically, they've got, you know, this effluent from a power plant. They're like, what do we do with this? And they're like, oh, let's turn it into a tourist destination. Why not? You know, so we could do that in downtown Fairbanks with the effluent that we're dumping into the Tina River, right? You know, why not, right? This is the way the Icelanders think. Okay, next slide. And then Ellie, so they have their own hot dog factory. Icelanders have amazing hot dogs because just like everywhere, they throw everything in, but they have a lot of sheep in Iceland. And so they taste different. They're really good. Ellie, this picture on the right was from last night on my boat. I was sitting on my boat and eating hartfisker with butter for dinner. So yeah, so a lot of local food production, really good local food. This is a geothermal. This is like my kids again. So baking geothermal bread in a community about an hour outside of Reykjavik. There. Next slide. Okay, large commercial. So that was kind of the small commercial stuff. Large commercial, this one, bottom line, 7 cents per kilowatt. Now, again, this is not the aluminum smelter. So this is not heavy industries. You know, those contracts are less than this. We don't know exactly what they are. But I think that at first, initially, they were like 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour. They've since been renegotiated and have kind of trended upward. But this would be for like a larger company. So you can see that they have a little bit cheaper cost of power in total. So, okay. That's it. Okay. So this is basically my last slide so we're not going to get to this other stuff. Who knows, maybe we do part 3 someday, but Iceland's policies, you know, they really made this like longstanding commitment to energy independence. And a lot of that was caused by the fact that they really they really struggled with energy imports, right? And more maybe than other places because they were a pretty impoverished nation for a lot of their history. And so they really decided to make this real commitment to energy independence. At the time where they decided to switch over to geothermal in a big way, they didn't even have an engineering program at their university. They actually came to Idaho, to Boise, Idaho, which has a district heating system, to learn how to even build a district heating system. They kind of built up their capabilities very systematically and very smartly. And there's a whole narrative to tell there that we don't have time for today. But they really made this longstanding commitment with very key, not really big, but very critical investments in like organizations, building up expertise, maintaining that expertise over time. So we mentioned the industry partnerships to build up infrastructure, investment in transmission, these subsidies for high cost regions. These are all kind of policies. We talked about all that. The Iceland Drilling Fund, that was a really important piece to all of this. So basically the most expensive or risky part of geothermal is drilling for the resource. And so what they did is they set up this fund where if a community or a municipality or a farmer, like in Bergstaddir, like drilled for geothermal and they didn't have a successful well, they could write that off. But if they were successful, then that would be converted into a long-term low interest loan from the state. And so there's very little risk for actually building out geothermal. And so the amount of geothermal heating that you see in Iceland is really pretty incredible. So they have this, pretty extensive energy plan. I mean, it's non-perfect, but it's like actually very easy to understand with like things that are green lit and orange lit and red lit. I'm actually interested to see how that's evolved over time because I know they've made a lot of changes since then. They have been very hesitant to develop an intertie with the rest of Europe. So there's been a lot of discussion about this idea of intertying Iceland with Europe. I think it would be a really bad idea because part of the reason why right now they're insulated from the very high prices in Europe is because of the fact that they're not intertied, right? So there's a lot of the idea of like exporting their energy in a form of value-added processing, which is what they do now. I think is a very good strategy for them. So, and then this investment in a knowledge economy. So they've been doing a lot. Again, would be interesting to find out, but almost every Icelander I meet is involved in some sort of private enterprise. They're involved with a restaurant or some kind of startup business or just doing all kinds of innovative and interesting things. And they've really like kind of put a big premium on building up a knowledge economy and like really developing companies and developing ideas that are really sort of very future looking. They have the largest direct air capture plant for carbon dioxide anywhere in the world is in Iceland, for example. They have a geothermal park. They've got this like ocean house that Ellie actually sits at. So like he's part of the ocean cluster, which is a bunch of innovative businesses in that space. And so there's a lot of other things that we could go on and talk about, but I should end here today.
Okay. Well, my goodness. I mean, round two was as good as round one.
Oh, yeah.
Only thing I would note is on that power bill where there was a charge that then got converted to a subsidy. That almost reminds me of telephones. I mean, there used to be I believe there still is a charge on your telephone bill. And what it's meant for is to defray the cost and encourage expansion of the telephone system. At least that's what it used to be for. To more far-flung, higher cost, harder to reach places.
This fee is actually, has the same effects, but solely with only with the electricity.
Okay.
Hey, Gwen, this is John Davies. Back to the very first cost graph that you had for the comparing residential rates, I think it was. Some of them were in green and some of them were in black, and it looked like the green ones, the rate was maybe a cent higher. What was the significance?
Yeah, because it's an open market. So like basically, like I think Ellie can speak to this precisely, but some of the like energy, they're kind of trading companies that actually don't own generation. So they just like buy and sell electricity. They might have a cheaper rate, Whereas like that's just kind of, you know, like our co-op, it might be slightly higher, but it's a local generator, local power. You might have a lower wheeling fee then, you know, there's like, it's a kind of complicated and dynamic market. But yeah, you're right. Ellie, maybe you want to speak to that. Like some of them were a cent or two cheaper than others when you looked at your options for who you were going to buy your power from, right?
Yeah, the green ones, those are companies that are actually producing energy or generating energy. The other companies are buying from the wholesale market. They're buying energy from Landsvirkjun that generates, I think, 77% of Icelandic energy. So they are, you know, intelligent IT companies that you can go along with. For example, this N1 company is the former one of three conglomerates in the fossil fuel sales in Iceland. They were Esso here back in the days, but they are now trying to transform the business and being a sailing company for energy. So they pulled in the electricity as well. And they state, you know, commercially wise, that they are always selling the most cheapest energy. There are some incentives, you know, if you buy there are some price schemes and so something like that, especially from the black ones, that could change a little bit. I think the final prices from those ones, but those are, you know, general listed prices. But it's important to state that, you know, with the electrician legislation here in Iceland, when they freed up the market, it is prohibited to have any constraints for the consumer to change. You can change every month. I think you're fixed for 30 days within each company, but it's prohibited to have any constraints that, you know, fixes you to buy electricity for some amount of time from this one, or something that makes it difficult for you to change your vendor. So it's quite open.
Thank you.
Of course, the floor is open for questions.
There's 4 chats there.
Oh, 4 chats. I think they're mostly sorry had to go. Oh no, okay. Oh, that's Ellie. Okay.
So I will say this, this consumer energy price structure is not without precedent, even in the United States. In Nebraska, I've got a little place, and every year, they don't do it every month, but every year, the heating company, the natural gas company, you have to pick which company you want to go with for that next year, and it sends out a similar price structure. And so this is very interesting. I wonder if they adopted a model, say from Iceland, or if this is maybe generally, I mean, does this happen elsewhere?
To be clear, like Iceland's model is not singular or unique. Like what I think is interesting about is how it's been applied in a small place, right? With a small number of customers and a lot of diversity in the industry that really grew up from this fact that there was a bunch of isolated grids and individual like producers, just like our co-ops that were ultimately interconnected. Their narrative is really, really similar. The way their market is structured is very similar to other places. There's not necessarily big differences. What they have done is tweaked it a little bit to accept the fact that they have like a small market and a small number of consumers. So distributing those costs across, you know, as equitably and as efficiently as possible has been pretty important for Iceland. The other thing is Iceland is not, I just want to be really careful to say, this model, which is essentially like, oh, someone in Fairbanks can buy their power from Homer Electric Association. You just apply a wheeling, you know, fee to it. I don't think that this is necessarily practical for Alaska. And so this is kind of where looking at other models too is pretty important. The Texas ERCOT model does things a little bit differently. That's also like kind of a single state model. It's 2 orders of magnitude bigger than Alaska's grid, right? 2 orders of magnitude bigger. It's like vastly larger, but there are some important like potential lessons learned there too. What they do is they kind of apply, they figure out the cost for transmission. ERCOT is kind of the grid operator there. They divide that across kilowatt hour sales. So everyone's sort of paying a postage stamp rate there. And that may be a better solution in Alaska than what they're doing, which is like applying a subsidy for, like, say, Fairbanks, that's like maybe further away from generation, you know. And so so that idea of like a more of a postage stamp rate might make more sense for Alaska, but I'm not going to claim to be like an expert in all aspects of this. What I'm trying to present is some case studies that I think could inform the direction that we go in Alaska, and Iceland is not the only one that we should be looking at.
Well, and would this kind of a model open up the private entrepreneurs, like you had a slide of that one fellow with 40 customers, Mike Kraft, for example, has his operation in Delta. Would this provide a stimulus for private generators?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the idea. It's an open highway, right? But there are, like, you know, there's still limitations in terms of the capacity of the grid. That doesn't really go away, right? And so a couple things happen there. Number one, you know, anybody that's connecting to the grid, there's got to be, you know, adequate ability of the grid to absorb that power. That's one thing. And so Landsnet makes that determination, not like the local utilities and things like that. Secondly, where there's inefficiencies in the grid, the generators are actually compensated for like line loss and things like that. So kilowatt hours that are sold, that are produced, but that aren't sold because they're kind of lost in the system, they're actually compensated for that. So that's one reason to, you know, beef up the grid and make sure that you kind of keep that at a minimum. So there's a number of like kind of facets like related to that, but basically there are more independent power producers on the grid in Iceland today than there is in Alaska, and a big part of this market is set up to try to encourage and incentivize opportunities for participation in the market as a generator. Ellie, is that fair?
Yes, totally. Landsnet is obligated to connect everyone who wants with the grid, either for, you know, pulling out of the grid or feeding into the grid, as long as, you know, they comply with their, you know, with the law that governs Landsnet. And Landsnet has to secure quality of the grid, has to secure the that the power is up, and so on and so forth. So there are constraints with delivery or capacity of the grid. The ring grid that we mentioned before, you know, the project that they closed in 84 or something, that is almost up to its capacity now. So there is a dialogue and discussion, you know, how to increase that. And the municipalities, they come along, they are either board members of Landsnet or using their influences otherwise, and they are stating that because we have no energy, we cannot attract investments within our community, and that's a constant struggle here.
So in that example, would that be, say, beefing up the red lines, what it looks like 132 kilovolt, the real ring? Yeah,
that is what can be defined as the initial ring grid, this 132 kilowatt line, and they have been enforcing that quite a lot. I think this is since 2010. We have on the upper right, we have an 220 kilowatt line between Krapland, Fljótsdalur. There are several investments that are in addition to this line, but that is a critical issue here, that both the ring grid, the 132 kilowatt line, is at capacity or even performing or at over capacity at the moment. And also we claim that, you know, we need more electricity for our EVs and such things. If the goals of the Icelandic government of getting carbon neutral for 2040 or 50 or what it is are to be fulfilled, we need to either cut off some of the heavy industry that I don't think will happen, or generate more.
All right. Well, we are well past the top of the hour. But I would, again, Gwen is being so generous, so is Ellie. So if anyone has any final questions, I would just open up the floor. All right. Well, it seems that hearing none, I just want to let everyone know Gwen was kind enough to actually give me the presentations. So if anyone would like these slide decks from this week and last week, you just email me and I can send them out.
Can I just say, we might need to clean it up a little because there's a whole bunch of extra slides, as you saw. So we might want to combine them or take the.
Okay, well then, all right, well, I retract that. So that was easy. Yeah,
Yeah,
never mind. Watch the
Nothing-
video.
Nothing secret, but we can clean it up into a single one. And then I think what might be even of more interest is that Ellie and I are trying to finalize this white paper that has this information plus more detail in it. Ellie, let's get that done in the next few days, huh?
Okay, then we'll do
All right.
that. We'll go ahead and hold off for that actual paper, and then we'll make sure that we get links to it. So we do have one final. I got a hand up, Elmer.
He's muted.
And this is a name I don't recognize. Hey, Elmer, your hand's up, but you're on mute. Okay, going once, going twice. All right. Well, hey, everybody, this has been great. Just to let you know, we will not be having a presentation or meeting next week. It's the Alaska Defense Forum. So the whole crew will be over there. But yeah, so again, you have the week off next week. I think we may even take the week off the following week too, because that'll be right after Labor Day. Is that Labor Day? Okay, so again, for now, for sure, take a nice extra week, maybe an extra 2, but just have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon for the next Energy for All Alaska Task Force. And really, again, can't thank you enough, Gwen, Ellie. Gwen, can I ask you to hang out real
Sure.
quick as everybody logs off? All right, see you, everybody.
You want me also to hang on, or?
Well, Dan came, and I thought actually you wanted to see Gwen.
I did.
That's what I thought I heard. All right, never mind. You're off the hook too. Gwen, you just sail safe.
Yeah, be safe.
Who
Dan Britton.
I'm always happy to listen to
I
Gwen.
know.
Yeah.
I know, Dan. We got to go get a cup of coffee sometime. I've got things I need to run by you.
I'm available anytime, so
All right,
give me a shout
all
when
right.
you get back.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you for
Yeah.
coming by. All right. Bye-bye.
See you guys.